This is Harold Takooshian at Fordham University in New York City. In 2021, I was both humbled and delighted to learn that I was receiving the Francis Mullen Award from the International Council of Psychologists, and that I should speak in 2022 at the ICP meeting, which I'm pleased to do, of course. I chose as my topic this question: is U.S. psychology xenophobic? In part, because it would allow me to speak more about ICP and Francis Mullen. I've been a member of ICP since 1987, 35 years, and I think this question of xenophobia has been around for a while, and I'd like to address it. And as I say, Francis Mullen was a legendary figure in psychology and ICP, but one that's little known. In fact, this photo of her has not been seen for over 30 years. It came thanks to the Center for the History of Psychology in Akron, Ohio, because we had no photo of Francis Mullen recently. And I look forward to speaking about her a bit. In fact, my presentation is in 4 parts. First, the original question about xenophobia, and then a review of 4 types of evidence about U.S. textbooks, organizations, resources, and funding. And then third, more about Francis Mullen and ICP, how they fit into this question of xenophobia. And finally, my conclusion. As you know, xenophobia is a fear or hatred of anything that is strange or foreign, from the Greek xenos, meaning strange, and phobos, fear or phobia. And to my knowledge, the first time this question was raised was by my friend and colleague, Virginia Sexton, who was president of the Eastern Psychological Association in 1984. And I still remember that day, April 14th, 1984, that Saturday when about 250 colleagues filled the auditorium in Baltimore. And Virginia boldly challenged us with this terse query: is American psychology xenophobic? And she gave some evidence of this. In numbers, the USA at that time had 75% of the world's psychologists. It published all the top journals in psychology and most of the most prominent books. USA psychology is heavily funded in both research and teaching. US psychologists often don't cite non-USA colleagues. US PhD programs were actually dropping their language requirements so that people should be expected to read other languages. Non-USA psychologists were heavily reliant on what's happening in the USA, and she felt that the USA dominates world psychology, and hence the question, is American psychology xenophobic? To Dr. Sexton's credit, when she published the article with her professor, Onwik Misiak, later that year, 1984, she pointed out that US psychology originated in Europe, but grew in the US into a monolingual field that has variously been called since then inbred, isolationist, domineering, even weird. But I say to her credit, because the word xenophobia did not appear in her later article. Instead, Dr. Sexton got our attention with her question, rather edgy question, I would say. But in her own career, she went on to emphasize the contributions of international colleagues. These are books that she had edited in Catholics in Psychology, History of Psychology, Psychology Around the World with Onwik Misiak, and then later in 1992, International Psychology with John Hogan. And she felt that American psychology had a positive role to play in international work. Let me look at these 4 areas for evidence about this issue of xenophobia. Are American psychologists xenophobic in 1984 and in today? First of all, about US textbooks. It's fair to say that about 2 million students a year in the US currently study introductory psychology. It is, by some measures, the single largest course on American campuses. If we look at the citations in these textbooks, what we see is quite clear. These are the top 10 cited people. The first is a a psychiatrist in Vienna, Sigmund Freud, then a developmentalist in Switzerland, Jean Piaget, and if we jump to number 7, Ivan Pavlov, a physician in Russia. 3 out of the 10 are distinctly non-xenophobic, are people from other countries. And the fact is, when we look at textbook analyses, citations, we see that overseas psychologists are indeed cited quite often. And this is on the increase. Second point is organizations in the United States. Let me share 3 of these. One is the APA, American Psych Association. It goes back all the way to 1944, during the Second War, that the APA formed its Committee on International Relations and Psychology, which is still a very vigorous committee today. And the purpose, that at that time, Presidents Herb Langefeld and Executive Officer Dale Wolfel wanted to do whatever they could to restore psychology in the war-torn countries of Europe. And in 1961, APA further opened its Office of International Affairs, which also exists today, a very active office under Mary Bullock and now Amanda Clinton, which seeks ways to bolster US and overseas psychology ties. In 1996, the CEO of APA, Raymond Fowler, pictured in your slide there, wrote the 50th anniversary editorial for the American Psychologist, leading journal in the US. And there he said that we should do more to bolster international psychology, and he pledged to involve more overseas psychologists as authors and editors of American Psychological Association journals. As many of you know, in 1997, APA finally authorized Division 52 International Psychology, which could not be more active in promoting psychology harmony between US and non-US psychologists. In fact, when I was the president of Division 52 in 2003, we had several programs to encourage overseas colleagues to participate. And 2 of these, the Division 52 Bulletin under Grant Rich by Shali Raval and Jenno Marie Grigbaum, went out of its way to recruit overseas authors for the Bulletin. The same is true of the journal, which was headed by Judith Gibbons from Guatemala, then Stu Carr in New Zealand, and currently Inez Meyer in South Africa, always trying to promote international psychology. Besides the APA, the other organization, the American Association for Psychological Science, in a way is doing even more. It retooled its name, and currently, since 2015, has gone global with international meetings. And in 2022, the APS strategic plan emphasized the desire to integrate international psychologists with Americans in one organization, which of course is happening right now. The third group I would point out is Psychi. Many of you know that in 1929, Psychi was formed at the 9th International Congress of Psychology in New Haven. In fact, that was the first international Congress on American soil. When Psychi was founded, it was in the shadow of international psychology. And the picture you see on the bottom, the color photo there, is 2009. We gather every 5 years at Yale University to celebrate the birth of Psychi. And in 2009, Psychi did the bold step of going global, a US honor society which decided to involve international participants. And that is not something that was encouraged by the Association of Psychology Honors, Association of Collegiate Honor Societies. But Psychi voted that, the chapters voted, and it's fair to say that this has taken off wonderfully. There are over a dozen nations now that have a Psychi chapter. What you see there is a picture of Psychi in Russia. I was able to install the first chapter in Eastern Europe back in October 2013. And you could see the joy on the faces of those professors and students at the People's Friendship University of Russia when they formed a Psychi chapter and bonded with their American colleagues. In fact, that university is a leading university, one of the top 500 in the world, and It's also a very multinational university. It has students from 150 nations on campus. And they also have a journal, the Rudin Journal, it's called. And the Rudin Journal has become a leader in bonding between American and international psychologists. This particular article you see, the journal brought together psychi chapters from 9 nations to talk about the value of students in psychology. And that was a special issue in 2019. A third point here is resources. And again, a good example is APA editor Susan Knapp, who points out that the APA and its press vigorously share world psychology with a multilingual staff. They have people who can abstract articles in many languages for the psychological abstracts. One author, John Adair in Canada, estimates that 45% of US psychology abstract entries refer to non-USA or non-English literature. So it's almost half, and it doesn't support the idea of xenophobia that the APA is going to such an extent. In fact, it's an odd fact, but the APA has been doing this since the 1920s, abstracting overseas articles. And when we talk about xenophobia, please look at your screen. One notorious example of xenophobia comes from Switzerland and appears in the APA abstracts in 1934. And that's when a Swiss psychiatrist, Carl Jung, wrote that Freud was describing a Jewish psychology, his psychoanalysis, which did not apply to National Socialists. And then you see the last line of his abstract there. National Socialism has an undreamed of strength and embryonic capacity for creating new cultural forms. I would say that this is xenophobia, the idea of dividing people based on religion or race. So APA, to its credit, was summarizing what's happening overseas. The fourth and final point is funding. It's true that US psychologists are funded well by NSF and IMH, other groups. But is this funding used in a xenophobic way? And I rhetorically ask, shall we ask this man? I wonder if any of you recognize this man, this legendary figure in America, not a psychologist. But the fact is, back in 1946, just after the war, Senator J. William Fulbright launched the Fulbright program, which tries to link American and non-American academics. And of course, the Fulbright program is still going strong. And even in 2022, there is still a Fulbright program in Russia, despite all the difficulties between our nations. Since 1946, 183,000 Fulbright scholars from 155 nations have served in the USA, plus 110,000 US scholars have served in other nations. When it comes to psychology, in just one 5-year period, 96 US psychologists taught or did research overseas, and 79 from other nations from 55 other nations served in the USA. 2021 was the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program. And it's fair to say that this is the opposite of xenophobic. It's a real source of harmony between nations. I should note, as an example of this people-to-people effort by Fulbright, that back in early this year, a very talented student, Dan Balva, and I put together an article on the pivotal role of students in international psychology. Quite an inspiring history of the students in our field. And we were going to submit it to a Russian journal headquartered an international journal headquartered in Rudin in Russia. But before we did that, on April 25th, we contacted an editor there and said, we see the invasion of Ukraine and the war heating up. Would this create a problem for your journal if we submitted this manuscript to you? We don't want to create problems. And her response was very quick and very full-throated on 2 points. One, she said that the psychologists in her country, including her university, are peace-loving people, and they feel powerless at what's happening within the government. And she said that it's very similar to what American professors and students experienced with the Vietnam War and the invasion of Iraq. They feel powerless at what's happening. And the second point she made was that Rudin Psychology Journal is a scientific journal, not a political journal. And if we have an article that's scientific, we should submit it and not avoid our Russian colleagues who really want to work with us and continue to be harmonious. And we did submit the article, and it did appear. And I would say that this is an example of the people to people, the enduring legacy, which we should not. Well, and let me say it this way: in the United States, we psychologists advise people to avoid anti-Asian bias. Asians should not be chastised because of the behavior of their political leaders. And by the same token, we shouldn't do that with our colleagues in other countries. Anyway, that's my point here about the Fulbright. Let me shift gears now to say more about ICP and Francis Mullen. Much of what I'll say is from Anne Marie O'Rourke's work. Dr. O'Rourke died this year in May at the age of 88. But for many years, Anne O'Rourke was the beloved co-editor of the ICP newsletter, and she was an editor of the 75th anniversary volume for ICP, where she contributed a 6-page history of ICP. And Anne O'Rourke loved ICP, and the final year of her life, 2021 and 2022, she expanded her 6-page history of ICP into 170 pages, a book on ICP at 80 years. And this book really reflects her love of ICP and many facts that are simply known by nobody else except her, which she included there. And this book, by the way, is available online if you contact me or one of the ICP officers. The fact is that ICP has a glorious history. If anything, it should be called xenophilic. In 1941, women in New York City wanted to do more to help the war effort. And they, being very energetic, they started an organization. And when word spread to other states in the country, 253 women became charter members of ICP, which at that time was called the National Council of Women Psychologists. This organization was very active and it grew quickly. It started admitting men, and it also started admitting people from other nations, to the point where in 1961, on its 20th anniversary, the council changed its name to the International Council of Psychologists. And since then, the ICP has been really a forum for international psychology men and women. In fact, in 1975, ICP tried to form an international division of APA, Division 36. That effort didn't succeed, but ICP wanted American psychology to work more closely with international psych. And one example of this is 1981, when ICP became one of the very first psychology organizations to register with the APA for consultative status. And to this day, it still enjoys that role. It's a leader among psychologists at the United Nations. If I look more closely at Francis Mullen, she too was an elder statesman of psychology like Anne O'Rourke. And when she completed a degree in 1939, her PhD at the University of Chicago, she immediately went into special education and testing and became not just a psychologist, but an administrator in the Chicago school system. For over 3 decades, Frances Mullen was an expert on school psychology and education, special education. In fact, she was elected a fellow of APA in 1943, just 4 years after completing her doctorate. Another thing, though, about Frances Mullen, which is perhaps less known, is that she loved to travel. She traveled all around the world, and in her 50s, she became a mountain climber. And there are stories about her quite remarkable. That Frances Mullen drove from Chicago with 3 medical students, a camper, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego at the tip of Chile. And all that time, she visited many different countries and always looked at the students and the psychology and the schools and the psychologists to see how American psychology could relate to psychologists overseas. And it's worth noting that at the age of 70, in 1972, Frances Mullen became the co-founder of the International School Psychology Association, ISPA, which today is very active in bridging American and non-American school psychologists. And she did that at the age of 70. Frances Mullen was president of ICP in 1975. She became the Secretary General, the first one in 1976, the first ICP meeting off US soil that was in Paris. And for 4 years, she was the Secretary General of ICP. And later on in 1987, when ICP met in New York City, Dr. Mullen received the first Distinguished Contribution Award from ICP. And that happens to be the meeting that I became involved in ICP in 1987. And in fact, this is a picture of the 1987 ICP meeting. At that time, ICP had 900 members in 70 nations. It was such a large organization. And it's fair to say from the moment I entered ICP, I saw how friendly it was. Very strong friendships. People enjoyed seeing each other. In the picture you see here, this is an ICP workshop at the APA meeting, which was in the same city. And from left to right, Gary Didavala, Hago Pambukian, Terry Prothero from Lebanon, Virginia Sexton, Ruben Ardilla from Columbia, South America, John Hogan from St. John's University. We had very large and very prosperous gatherings. And this is a picture on the rooftop of Fordham University in New York, where the vice president of Fordham, Reverend McMahon, hosted a gathering. And we had over 100 ICP psychologists there, many of the authors and officers of ICP, just a very joyous gathering. In conclusion, I would point out the original question about is psychology xenophobic was posed by Virginia Sexton. But if we look at the 4 types of evidence I presented, I would say that the record is pretty clear that American psychology is not xenophobic. It's large, 75% of psychologists in North America, but that has changed. Today, it's only about 25% in North America as psychology grows outside the world. The third point is that Frances Mullen was the opposite of xenophobic, and it's fair to say that ICP is the same. The glorious history of ICP reaching out to its international colleagues is anything but fear of foreigners. My 3 conclusions is that psychology in the 19th century began as a global discipline outside the USA. But in the 20th century, the USA dominated it. It became an American discipline. But in the 21st century, it's clear that psychology is again becoming more global than ever. Only 25% of psychologists today live in the United States. And the US can and should continue to have a supportive role in international psychology. I want to thank ICP for this Mullen Award. I'm delighted that it's now part of my identity. And I wish you a good meeting at ICP this month. And may ICP continue to offer positive relations with psychologists and overcome the politics that separate us. Thank you.